Steam locomotives were magnificent machines, but the men who operated them worked in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors. From practices that turned engines into ticking bombs to habits that killed crews by the thousands, these are 20 dangerous habits of steam engineers that are now strictly illegal. Let us start at number 20. Number 20. Sleeping in the cab. During rest stops. Before federal hours of service laws existed, engineers would catch sleep wherever they could find it. The locomotive cab became an unofficial bedroom, with crews dozing against hot boilers between runs. The problem was the timing. Engineers would fall asleep during brief station stops, with the boiler still under pressure, the fire still burning, and nobody watching the gauges. Water levels could drop to dangerous lows while the engineer snored. Pressure could climb past safety thresholds. In 1887, a sleeping engineer in Pennsylvania awoke to find his crown sheet glowing red seconds before it failed. The resulting explosion killed 2 workers on the platform. Railroad companies initially encouraged this practice because it meant faster turnarounds. Why waste time sending crews to proper rest facilities when they could just sleep in the cab? The Hours of Service Act of 1907 finally addressed this by mandating proper rest periods away from the locomotive. Today, sleeping in any part of the operating cab during duty is strictly prohibited, and engineers must have dedicated rest facilities. The practice of grabbing sleep against a 200-degree boiler seems insane now, but for decades it was just how things were done. Number 19. Operating without eye protection on locomotives. The steam locomotive cab was a flying debris zone. Coal dust, cinders, smoke, and red-hot sparks constantly bombarded crews from the firebox. Add the wind rushing through open cab windows at 60 miles per hour, and you had a recipe for blindness. Engineers and firemen routinely worked without any eye protection whatsoever. The results were predictable and devastating. By 1890, railroad workers had one of the highest rates of occupational eye injuries in America. Cinders embedded in corneas were so common that railroad surgeons developed specialized extraction techniques. Some crews fashioned their own goggles from tinted glass and leather scraps, but these were considered unmanly by many railroad men. The culture actively discouraged protection. Real railroaders took the pain. This macho attitude cost thousands of workers their sight. One study from 1905 found that 23% of veteran engineers had significant vision impairment from workplace exposure. Modern regulations require appropriate eye protection in locomotive cabs and during any maintenance work. The days of squinting through coal smoke while hot cinders peppered your face are thankfully over. Number 18. Riding on the running boards. The running boards were narrow metal platforms along the locomotive's sides, designed for maintenance access. They were never intended for travel, but crews routinely rode them anyway, clinging to handrails while the locomotive thundered down the track at full speed. Firemen would climb out to oil valve gear while the engine was moving. Engineers would hang off the side to see around curves. Brakemen would traverse the entire length of a moving train on these precarious perches. The death toll was staggering. A 1912 Interstate Commerce Commission report found that falls from running boards and other external locomotive surfaces killed over 300 workers annually. The dangers multiplied in bad weather. Ice-covered running boards became death traps. One misstep, one loose handhold, and you were under the wheels. Some railroads actually required this practice, directing firemen to oil mechanisms while underway to save time at stations. Profit trumped safety until regulations finally prohibited riding on external surfaces while trains were in motion. Today, any maintenance requiring access to external locomotive components must be performed while the engine is stationary. The running boards remain, but they are for standing still, not for riding. Number 17. Ignoring the water glass. The water glass was called the most important window on the train for good reason. It showed the water level in the boiler, and if that level dropped too low, disaster followed within seconds. The crown sheet, the top of the firebox, had to stay submerged in water. Let it go dry, and the intense heat would weaken the metal almost instantly. Engineers routinely ignored low water readings to maintain speed. Some deliberately ran with dangerously low water to reduce weight and increase performance. Others simply forgot to check during the chaos of heavy operations. The consequences were catastrophic. A 1943 explosion on the New York Central killed the engineer when his crown sheet failed after running dry. The locomotive had been climbing a grade, and the water had surged forward in the boiler, exposing the crown sheet without any warning. Modern regulations require continuous monitoring of water levels and immediate corrective action when levels drop below minimums. Low water alarms are mandatory, and crews must dump the fire immediately if water drops critically low. Running a locomotive with insufficient water is now a criminal offense in most jurisdictions. Number 16. The flying switch. This was yard work at its most dangerous and deadly. A flying switch involved uncoupling cars while the train was moving, then having the engineer accelerate to create a gap. The brakeman would throw a switch, and the detached cars would roll onto a siding under their own momentum. It required split-second timing and complete trust between crew members. When it worked, it saved time. When it failed, it killed people. Brakemen were crushed between cars that moved unexpectedly. They fell under wheels while running alongside moving equipment. They were struck by switches thrown at the wrong moment. Railroad liability case law is filled with wrongful death suits from flying switch accidents. Widows of brakemen killed in these operations became so common that insurers started refusing coverage for workers who performed them. Some railroads continued the practice, despite mounting casualties because the time savings benefited their bottom line. The practice was finally outlawed in most operations by the mid-20th century. Modern switching requires trains to stop before uncoupling, with proper hand signals and radio communication throughout. The time savings of flying switches never justified the horrific body count they produced. Number 15. Tying down the safety valve. This practice was so dangerous that it prompted the invention of tamper-proof valve designs. Safety valves released excess steam pressure before boilers could explode. Some engineers tied them down to get more power, silencing the annoying hiss and squeezing extra performance from the engine. The results were often fatal. The best friend of Charleston became the first American locomotive to explode in 1831 when the fireman tied down the safety valve because he was tired of hearing it whistle. The blast killed him instantly and scattered debris across the yard. Some accounts say he sat on a board placed over the valve. This practice continued for decades, despite the obvious dangers. Engineers seeking competitive advantages in races or attempting to maintain schedules on steep grades would disable their only protection against catastrophic failure. John Ramsbottom finally solved the problem in 1856 by inventing a tamper-proof valve design that became universal on railways. Modern safety valves are sealed and certified, with tampering considered a serious criminal offense. Any attempt to disable or modify pressure relief systems today results in immediate termination and potential prosecution. Before 1907, there were no federal limits on how long a railroad engineer could work. Crews routinely operated locomotives for 20, 24, even 36 hours straight. Management considered exhaustion a personal weakness, not a safety hazard. Schedules were king, and crews who complained about fatigue were viewed as unreliable. The accident statistics told a different story. Exhausted engineers missed signals, fell asleep at the throttle, and made fatal judgment errors. A 1905 study found that accident rates increased dramatically after the 12th hour of continuous duty. By hour 20, the risk of human factors accidents had tripled. The railroad companies knew this, but prioritized schedule keeping over crew welfare. One railroad executive reportedly said that dead engineers could be replaced, but late freight could not. Public outrage finally forced change after a series of spectacular wrecks attributed to crew fatigue. The Hours of Service Act of 1907 limited engineers to 16 consecutive hours of duty. This was later reduced to 14 hours in 1969, then 12 hours in 1976. Today, Crew fatigue management is a federal priority, with mandatory rest periods and monthly hour limits strictly enforced by the Federal Railroad Administration. Manual link and pin coupling. Before automatic couplers, connecting railroad cars required a brakeman to stand between two moving cars and guide a heavy iron link into place, then drop a pin through holes that had to align perfectly. The margin for error was measured in inches. The margin between life and death was measured in moments. The link would swing unpredictably. The cars would lurch. Brakemen lost fingers, hands, and arms with sickening regularity. A slight miscalculation meant crushed limbs or death. By 1890, an estimated 400 railroad workers were killed annually in coupling accidents alone. Another 11,000 suffered serious injuries. One safety advocate noted that railroad workers were losing fingers at a rate that would have emptied entire towns of able-bodied men. The Safety Appliance Act of 1893 mandated automatic couplers that allowed cars to connect without anyone standing between them. Railroads resisted the expense for years, but Congress held firm. By 1900, link and pin coupling was being phased out across the nation. Today, automatic knuckle couplers are universal, and no worker should ever be positioned between cars during coupling operations. Number 12. Running through tunnels without ventilation. Steam locomotives in tunnels created death traps. The exhaust had nowhere to go, and smoke would fill the confined space within seconds. Crews inhaled toxic concentrations of carbon monoxide and sulfur compounds while struggling to see through the murk. Some tunnels claimed multiple crews before anyone addressed the problem. Engineers would tie wet rags over their faces as primitive respirators, then floor the throttle to escape as quickly as possible. Firemen would hold their breath while blindly shoveling coal into the firebox. Passengers in following cars sometimes suffocated when smoke infiltrated poorly sealed coaches. The casualty reports were horrific. One Italian tunnel killed over 500 workers during construction and continued claiming lives in operation. American tunnels were marginally better, but still deadly. The solution came from technology rather than regulation. Electric and diesel locomotives eventually replaced steam power in major tunnels. Where steam continued, forced ventilation systems became mandatory. Today, any locomotive operation in confined spaces requires specific ventilation protocols and emergency breathing equipment. Running blind through smoke is no longer tolerated. Number 11. Drinking on the job. The early railroad culture had a complicated relationship with alcohol. Whiskey was considered medicinal, useful for fighting cold weather and numbing the aches of brutal physical labor. Many engineers kept flasks in their cabs. Some were visibly intoxicated during operations, and management looked the other way as long as trains arrived on time. The results were predictable and often deadly. Drunk engineers missed signals, misjudged speeds, and fell asleep at the controls. An 1889 collision in Massachusetts killed 23 passengers when an intoxicated engineer ran through a stop signal at full speed. He had been drinking since morning and could barely stand when rescuers pulled him from the wreckage. Railroad Rule G, prohibiting alcohol consumption on duty, was adopted by most American railroads by the 1890s, but enforcement was spotty at best. Many crews ignored it entirely. Today, federal regulations require zero tolerance for alcohol. Random testing is mandatory, and any trace of alcohol results in immediate removal from service. The blood alcohol limit for railroad workers is effectively zero, and it is stricter than any state's drunk driving standard. Number 10. Skipping boiler blowdowns. Inside every steam locomotive boiler, minerals in the water slowly accumulated into a deadly layer called scale. This calcium deposit coated tubes and fireboxes, reducing heat transfer and creating hot spots that could fail catastrophically. The solution was simple. Regular blowdowns flushed sediment from the system. Many engineers skipped them entirely. Blowdowns wasted water, wasted time, and required stopping the locomotive. Time-conscious crews would go weeks without properly cleaning their boilers, allowing scale to build inch by inch. The consequences were insidious. Scale acted as insulation, preventing heat from reaching water. Fireboxes worked harder, burning more coal to produce the same steam. Metal overheated where scale was thickest, weakening the structure designed to contain explosive pressures. One British investigation found scale buildup directly caused a firebox collapse that killed 3 workers. The metal had overheated so severely it gave way. Modern regulations require documented blowdown schedules with specific intervals and procedures. Heritage railways must maintain detailed logs proving proper water treatment. The days of running boilers clogged by years of mineral deposits are over. Number 9. Operating without standardized signals. Before the 1890s, every railroad in America had its own signal system. One line might use a white flag to mean proceed, and red to mean stop. The next railroad over might reverse those meanings entirely. Hand signals varied by company, by region, and sometimes by individual crew. The chaos was deadly, and it killed hundreds. Engineers switching between railroads faced deadly confusion. A signal that meant all clear on one line could mean danger on another. In 1853, a conductor on the Providence and Worcester Railroad caused a fatal collision, partly because his watch was wrong. The lack of standardized signals made disaster inevitable. Crews had no universal language for danger. The time interval system used before block signaling relied on human judgment and inconsistent signals. Trains were spaced by time rather than by position. If a preceding train stopped unexpectedly, following trains had no reliable warning. The Railway Safety Appliance Act of 1893 began standardizing equipment, but comprehensive signal standardization took decades. Today, federal regulations mandate specific signal meanings across all railroads. No crew should face confusion about whether a signal means stop or go. Number 8. Bypassing gauge-cocks and tri-cocks. The gauge-cocks, also called tri-cocks, were the backup system for determining water level when sight glasses failed. 3 small valves mounted at different heights on the boiler could be opened to check the water position. Open the bottom cock and water flows. Open the middle one and steam appears. That tells you exactly where the water level sits. Engineers routinely ignored or disabled them. Some found the valves annoying. Others plugged them because they leaked. Many forgot how to use them properly. The problem became critical when sight glasses gave false readings. Mud, scale, or steam could make a glass show water when the boiler was actually dry. Without functioning gauge cocks, crews had no secondary verification. One inspector described finding locomotives with all 3 gauge cocks welded shut by accumulated rust because nobody had operated them in years. The crew had no idea their only backup indicators were useless. Modern boiler codes require multiple redundant water level indicators tested regularly. Gauge cocks must be operational and documented in inspection reports. The backup systems that could have prevented countless crown sheet failures are now mandatory. Number 7. Operating with uninspected boilers. Between 1880 and 1890, over 2,000 boilers exploded in the United States. Many were never inspected at all. Railroad companies resisted mandatory inspections as government overreach and unnecessary expense. The Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection Company was founded in 1866 because the industry refused to police itself. Boilers operated for years without anyone checking for corrosion, cracks, or wear. Internal furrowing, a type of corrosion that ate grooves into plates, went undetected until catastrophic failure. Lap joints weakened by stress corrosion cracking gave way without warning. The 1905 Brockton Shoe Factory explosion killed 58 people and finally forced action. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers published the first boiler code in 1914. The Locomotive Boiler Inspection Act of 1911 mandated federal oversight. Today, every locomotive boiler must pass regular inspections with documented results. Ultrasonic thickness testing detects invisible internal corrosion. The era when a boiler might operate for a decade without anyone looking inside is history. written in the names of workers killed by preventable failures. The locomotive cab was never designed for passengers, but engineers routinely let friends, family, and strangers ride along. Company officials climbed aboard for inspections. Politicians wanted to experience the view. Children of railroad employees grew up riding footplates as treats. The practice seemed harmless until accidents happened. In crashes and explosions, unauthorized passengers had no protection, no assigned position, and no emergency training. They became additional casualties in disasters that might have killed only trained crew. Insurance records from the early 1900s list dozens of unauthorized riders killed in locomotive accidents. Their families could not collect benefits because they were never supposed to be there. Some railroads encouraged the practice for public relations. Others banned it after lawsuits from families of dead visitors. Crews never knew whether carrying passengers would end their careers or earn them praise. Federal regulations now strictly prohibit unauthorized persons in locomotive cabs during operation. Every individual must be documented and authorized. The days of casual footplate tourism ended when the industry recognized that locomotives are workplaces, not amusement rides. Number 5. Using contaminated water. Water quality could turn a perfectly maintained boiler into a time bomb. Minerals caused scale. Organic matter caused foaming that made water levels impossible to read accurately. Acidic water corroded metal from the inside. Alkaline water caused caustic embrittlement, silently weakening boiler plates until they failed without warning. Engineers took water wherever they could find it, from stagnant ponds, muddy rivers, and irrigation ditches. If it was wet, it went in the tender. Some water sources were so contaminated that boilers required cleaning after every run. Others slowly poisoned the metal over months of accumulated damage. Railroads knew about water quality, but considered treatment an unnecessary expense. Caustic embrittlement was identified as early as the 1890s, but many companies ignored the science. The results were boiler failures that investigators blamed on other causes until metallurgists identified the distinctive cracking patterns of embrittlement. Modern boiler operations require treated water that meets specific chemical standards. Water treatment plants ensure proper chemistry before water enters any boiler. Random fill-ups from whatever pond happened to be nearby are now prohibited. Number 4. Operating with defective brakes. Air brakes revolutionized railroad safety, but only when they worked. Before the Safety Appliance Act of 1893, many locomotives relied on handbrakes, requiring brakemen to run along car roofs and manually spin brake wheels. Even after air brakes became mandatory, maintenance was often neglected. Engineers operated trains with known deficiencies rather than delay for repairs. Leaking airlines, stuck valves, and worn components were ignored as long as some brakes functioned. The attitude was that partial braking was better than no braking, so why stop for repairs? The consequences played out on mountain grades and in crowded yards. Trains unable to stop properly rear-ended other trains or overran stations. Runaway locomotives crashed through barriers designed for normal braking. One railroad safety study found over 30% of brake systems had defects requiring immediate repair. Today, brake inspections are mandatory before every train movement. Defective brakes must be repaired or removed from service immediately. Federal inspectors can stop any train and conduct unannounced brake tests. The acceptance of partially functioning brakes ended when regulators realized how many deaths resulted. Number 3. Inadequate crew training. Operating a steam locomotive required knowledge that could not be learned from a book. Water levels, steam pressure, firing techniques, and emergency procedures demanded hands-on experience. Yet railroads routinely promoted workers with minimal training, simply because they needed bodies in the cab. A fireman might become an engineer after a few months of observation. Nobody verified understanding of crown sheet temperatures, water management, or emergency protocols. Some railroads ran formal training programs. Others told new engineers to figure it out. Inexperienced crews made mistakes veterans would never commit. They ran boilers dry during grade climbs. They failed to recognize warning signs of impending failure. They panicked in emergencies instead of following procedures. One accident investigation found the engineer had been promoted 3 weeks earlier, with zero formal training. Modern locomotive engineers must complete federally mandated training programs with documented competencies. Certification requires passing examinations covering safety procedures and operating rules. The informal apprenticeship system that produced engineers through trial and error has been replaced by structured professional training. Number 2. Running above rated pressure. Every steam locomotive had a rated working pressure, the maximum safe operating limit for its boiler. Engineers routinely exceeded it. The temptation was simple. More pressure meant more power, faster speeds, and the ability to haul heavier loads. Running a few pounds above the limit seemed harmless. The safety valves would blow off excess anyway, except when they did not. Safety valves could stick, clog, or be disabled. Pressure gauges could be inaccurate, showing safe readings, while actual pressure climbed into dangerous territory. Boilers weakened by years of service might fail at pressures well below original ratings. Even new boilers could have hidden defects, making rated pressure optimistic. Railroad companies sometimes set pressure limits that pushed boilers to their absolute maximum for more performance. The 1944 NYC explosion at Elkhart occurred when pressure built beyond safe limits in a standing locomotive. Modern regulations set working pressures with substantial safety margins. Boilers must be rated to withstand pressures far above normal operating limits. Pressure relief systems are redundant and tamper-proof. Operating above rated pressure is now a criminal offense, not just a company rule violation. Number 1. Ignoring track warrants and authority limits. The deadliest habit of all was simple arrogance. Some engineers believed they knew their territory so well that they did not need to follow the rules. Some ran past stop signals because they were sure the track was clear. Crews exceeded their authority limits to reach the next station faster. The railroad system depended on trust. When a dispatcher issued a track warrant, everyone assumed the engineer would honor its limits. When signals showed stop, everyone assumed trains would actually stop. When rules specified speed limits, everyone assumed crews would obey. But they often did not. Engineers racing to maintain schedules pushed beyond authorized territory. Crews confident in their experience ignored signals they deemed unnecessary. The result was head-on collisions between trains that should never have occupied the same track. The 1856 Camp Hill disaster killed over 60 when 2 trains collided because crews exceeded their authorities. Modern positive train control systems physically prevent trains from exceeding speed limits or entering unauthorized territory. The era when an engineer could decide the rules did not apply ended when technology made such defiance impossible. And that is all, folks. 20 dangerous habits turned steam locomotives into widowmakers until regulations stepped in. Subscribe for more railroad history. Here is another video I have selected for you. See you next time.